For a spoonful of this, over 12 million people were shipped across an ocean in chains. This is the sweetest crime in history. Look at this. A single spoonful of sugar. White, weightless, ordinary. It sits in your coffee this morning without a second thought. You've eaten it your whole life. It costs almost nothing. And that is exactly the point. Because for a spoonful of this, over 12 million people were dragged from their homes, packed into the bellies of wooden ships, and carried across an entire ocean in chains. Not for gold, not for silver, not for some glittering jewel. For this. For sweetness. This is the sweetest crime in history, and almost no one who tastes it ever knows the story. Rewind 500 years. Sugar was not always cheap. Once, it was one of the rarest luxuries on the face of the earth. In the courts of Europe, it was called white gold, and the name was not poetry. A single cone of refined sugar could cost more than a working man earned in a month. Kings displayed it. Queens hoarded it. It was locked away like treasure, guarded like coin, handed out in tiny shavings to impress the powerful. It was so precious that in the court of Queen Elizabeth I, the nobility ate so much of it that their teeth rotted black in their skulls. And here is the part that tells you everything you need to know about human vanity. They did not hide it. Black teeth became fashion. Women who could not afford real sugar blackened their teeth on purpose, just to look rich. Think about that for a moment. People were willing to destroy their own faces to seem like they belonged to the world of sweetness. That is how deep the hunger ran, and we haven't even reached the blood yet. If a craving this powerful pulls you in, subscribe now, because it only gets darker from here, and you do not want to miss where this ends. Because vanity is a small crime. The real crime was only beginning. A taste, once discovered, does not stay a luxury for long. The rich wanted more. Then the merchants wanted to sell more. Then everyone, from the palace to the poorest tavern, wanted a spoonful of what the kings had. Demand rose like a tide, year after year, and it did not stop rising. And that created a problem, a terrible, world-changing problem. Sugar does not come from a mine. It does not sit in the ground waiting to be dug. It comes from a plant, sugarcane, a tall, tough, brutal crop that has to be cut by hand under a burning sun, hauled, crushed, and boiled in heat that could kill a man where he stood. Growing sugar was not farming. It was punishment. It broke bodies. It devoured lives. So, the men who wanted to grow rich on Europe's hunger asked themselves a single, monstrous question. A question that would echo across 3 continents and haunt the world for centuries. Who could they force to do the dying? Europe wanted its sweetness. Someone, somewhere, was going to pay the price in blood. And the men with the ships and the money had already begun to look across the sea, toward a continent full of people they did not see as people at all. The tide of demand was rising, and there was no one left to cut the cane. That is where the real story begins. There was no one left to cut the cane. That single fact, dull, almost administrative, became the seed of one of the greatest horrors the world has ever known. Because Europe's hunger for sweetness had grown into something monstrous, and monstrous appetites demand monstrous solutions. The first attempt was obvious. The colonists who ran the early plantations in the Atlantic Islands and the New World tried to use the people already there. Indigenous peoples of the Americas were forced into the fields, whipped into the cane, worked until they dropped. But something went wrong for the planters, horribly from their cold accounting point of view. The native populations died, not in dozens, in the millions. Diseases carried from Europe, smallpox, measles, influenza, tore through communities that had never encountered them, and where the sickness did not kill, the labor did. Entire nations vanished within a single generation. For the men counting profit, this was not a tragedy. It was a supply problem. They needed bodies that would not break as fast. They needed a source that would not run dry. And they turned their eyes across the ocean to the west coast of Africa, where they saw not human beings, but a resource. An endless one, they believed. A supply that could be bought, shipped, replaced, and used up like coal in a furnace. This is the moment the machine was built. Not a machine of iron and steam, but a machine of ships and greed, spanning 3 continents, turning on a single motion, around and around, forever. Historians would later give it a clean geometric name, the triangular trade. 3 points. 3 legs of a journey, and on every single one, someone was making a fortune. Picture the first leg. A ship leaves a European port, packed not with passengers, but with cargo, guns, gunpowder, iron bars, cloth, cheap manufactured goods, and rum. It sails south to the coast of Africa, and there the cargo is traded, not for money, but for people. Human beings exchanged for muskets and liquor, handed over, chained, and marched into the hold of the waiting ship. Now the second leg, the worst leg, the one that has a name so heavy it is spoken carefully even today, the Middle Passage. The same ship that carried iron and cloth now carried human beings across the open Atlantic, crammed into a darkness below deck where a person could not sit up straight, could not turn, could barely breathe. Weeks at sea, sometimes months. The conditions were so lethal that ship captains planned for the dead the way a merchant plans for spoiled goods, a percentage expected never to arrive alive. And the third leg. The ship, lighter now, its human cargo sold in the ports of the Americas, is loaded again, this time with the very thing that started all of it: sugar, and rum, and molasses. The sweet wealth of the plantations, carried back to Europe to be sold at enormous profit, funding the next voyage, the next guns, the next ship full of people. Around and around and around. Every turn of the wheel made someone rich. Every turn cost someone else everything. And here is what makes it so chilling. This was not chaos. It was not the work of a few evil men acting in the shadows. It was organized, legal, respectable, insured by banks, financed by investors, blessed by governments who taxed every barrel and celebrated the wealth pouring in. Ordinary merchants filled out ordinary paperwork for the buying and selling of human lives, and then went home to their families and slept soundly. The machine ran on one belief, repeated until it felt like truth, that the people in the hold were not people at all. But a machine like this needs fuel, and the fuel was human beings. Millions of them, carried toward a place where the real horror waited. Not the ship, not the sea, something worse, the plantation itself. Because getting them across the ocean alive was only the beginning. What was done to them once they arrived, on those beautiful sun-drenched islands where the sugar grew, was a cruelty so deliberate, so cold, that it defies belief even now. And that is where we go next, the plantation. From a distance, it looked like paradise. Endless green fields swaying under a Caribbean sky, white great houses with cool verandas, the smell of the sea, the warmth of the sun. To a European visitor stepping off a ship, it must have seemed like the edge of Eden. It was not Eden. It was a factory built to consume human beings, and it ran on a logic so cold it barely feels human to describe. Here is the truth the sugar barons understood and lived by. A field of sugarcane, once ripe, must be cut immediately. Wait too long and the sugar inside the stalk begins to rot, and the profit rots with it. So the harvest was a race against time, a brutal, relentless sprint under the burning sun. Men and women worked bent double for 18 hours a day, swinging heavy blades, hauling cane, feeding the mills. And the mills were the worst of all. To turn cane into sugar, the stalks had to be crushed between massive rollers. Then the juice boiled down in enormous copper vats over roaring fires, in heat so extreme it could kill. Workers stood beside those vats through the night, exhausted, half asleep on their feet. And when a tired hand slipped into the rollers, the machine did not stop. It could not stop. So beside each mill hung a blade, kept sharp, kept ready, for one purpose: to cut off the trapped arm before the whole body was dragged in and the machine was lost. Read that again. The tool was not there to save the person, it was there to save the machine. That single detail tells you everything about how these human beings were seen, not as workers, not as people with names and mothers and children, as parts, replaceable parts in an engine of profit. And the accounting proved it. On the sugar islands, the death rate was so staggering that plantations could not sustain their own population. People died faster than children could be born, and the barons did the math, cold, deliberate math, and came to a monstrous conclusion. It was cheaper to work a human being to death in a few short years and simply buy another than to feed, rest, and keep that person alive. Think about the horror hidden inside that sentence. An entire economy was designed around the idea that a human life was a cheap, disposable input, used up like fuel, then replaced from the endless stream of ships still crossing the sea. On some islands, the average enslaved person did not survive more than 7 years in the fields. 7 years. And then the sea delivered more. This was not the cruelty of one wicked master losing his temper. This was policy. It was written into ledgers, calculated by respectable men in comfortable offices thousands of miles away. Men who never heard a scream, never smelled the boiling houses, never saw the blades by the mills. They saw numbers, and the numbers said, "Sweetness pays." Meanwhile, back in Europe, the sugar arrived clean and white and perfect, stirred into tea in elegant drawing rooms, baked into cakes for celebrations, sold in shops to families who had no idea, or chose not to know, that every crystal carried the weight of a life shortened, a body broken, a name erased. That is the true face of the sweetest crime. Not a single villain, but a whole world quietly agreeing to look away. But cruelty this deep does not vanish into silence forever. Pressure builds, rage builds, and on one island, the richest, most profitable piece of land on the entire planet, the crown jewel of the whole bloody system, the pressure was building towards something no empire believed was possible. A place where the enslaved outnumbered their masters more than 10 to 1. A place sitting on the edge of an explosion, and its name was about to be burned into history. Its name was Saint-Domingue. Today, you know it by a different name, Haiti. But in the late 1700s, it was the single most valuable colony on the face of the earth. Not one of the most valuable, the most. This one small island, roughly the size of a modest region on a map, produced more wealth than vast empires elsewhere. It grew the sugar and the coffee that Europe could not live without, and the money that poured out of it was almost beyond imagining. France called it the Pearl of the Antilles, the jewel in the crown. Fortunes were built on it. Entire cities in France, their grand harbours, their elegant streets, their wealthy merchant families, grew fat on the profits of this one island. It was, quite literally, the beating heart of an empire's fortune. But every empire that builds paradise on suffering makes the same fatal mistake. It forgets who is holding the knife. Because to produce that staggering wealth, Saint-Domingue devoured human lives at a rate that horrified even other slave colonies. So many people were worked to death that ships had to keep arriving, year after year, just to replace the dead. And that constant hunger for more bodies created a situation the masters never truly reckoned with: the numbers. On this island, the enslaved did not merely outnumber the free, they overwhelmed them. For every white colonist, there were more than 10 enslaved Africans. In some regions, far more. 500,000 people held in bondage, ruled by a tiny minority who kept control through nothing but fear, the whip, and the belief that terror alone could hold the line forever. Sit with that arithmetic for a moment, because the masters clearly did not. They had built their entire fragile world on top of a population that vastly outnumbered them, a population brutalized beyond endurance, and, crucially, one that had not forgotten what it meant to be free. That last part matters more than anything. Many of the enslaved on Saint-Domingue had not been born into slavery. They had been born free, in Africa, in kingdoms with their own armies, their own histories, their own memories of dignity. Some had been soldiers. They knew how to fight. They had been captured, chained, and shipped across the sea, but the memory of freedom does not drown in an ocean. It waits. It burns quietly. It passes in whispers from one person to the next in the dark of the slave quarters, in a language the masters did not bother to learn. And so, across the plantations of that beautiful, blood-soaked island, something began to move beneath the surface. Not open rebellion, not yet. Something quieter and far more dangerous. A network. Messages carried between estates, meetings held in secret at night, deep in the forests and the mountains where the masters did not go. Trust built person by person, plantation by plantation, until an entire enslaved population was linked by threads invisible to the men who thought they owned them. The barons sipped their wine and counted their gold and slept in their fine houses, convinced their world was permanent. They saw obedience and mistook it for acceptance. They saw silence and mistook it for peace. They were sitting on a volcano and calling it solid ground. All it needed was a spark, a signal, a single night when the whispers would stop being whispers and become a roar. And far away, across the ocean, that spark was already being struck. Because France itself was about to erupt, its own people rising against their own masters, shouting words that would cross the sea and land on Saint-Domingue like fire on dry grass. Liberty, equality, freedom for all men. All men. The enslaved of Saint-Domingue heard those words, and they asked a question that would bring the mightiest empire in the world to its knees. Did all men mean them too? Did all men mean them too? The masters had an answer, and it was instant. No, of course not. When the revolutionaries in France shouted about the rights of man, about liberty and equality for all, they meant themselves. White men, free men, men of property. The enslaved were not part of the sentence. They were the furniture of the world, not its citizens. But words, once spoken, cannot be unheard. And these words had crossed the ocean and landed among 500,000 people who had every reason to take them literally. The colony began to crack. First among the white colonists themselves, who split into bitter factions, some loyal to the old king, some to the new revolution, all of them clawing at each other for power. Then among the free people of color, many of them wealthy, educated, landowners in their own right, who demanded the equality the revolution had promised, and were brutally refused, some tortured and executed in public as a warning. And all the while, the enslaved watched. They saw their masters divided, distracted, tearing at each other's throats. They saw the men who ruled them suddenly weak, suddenly afraid. And in the slave quarters at night, the whispers grew sharper, more urgent, more organized than ever before. Then came August of 1791. On a night thick with tropical storm clouds, deep in the forests of the northern plains, a gathering took place that the masters would never have believed possible. Hundreds of enslaved men and women came together in secret, under cover of darkness and rain, and made a decision that would set the richest colony on earth on fire. They would rise, all of them, at once. And rise they did. Within days, the northern plain, the wealthiest sugar region on the island, was in flames. Plantations that had stood as monuments to profit and cruelty burned to the ground. The great houses lit the night sky. The fields of cane that had swallowed so many lives went up like torches. For the first time, the people who had been treated as disposable turned and struck back at the machine that had consumed them, and the machine could not stop them. The masters were stunned. This was not supposed to happen. The whole system had been built on the certainty that fear would hold forever, that the enslaved were incapable of organizing, incapable of fighting, incapable of winning. Every assumption they had lived by shattered in a single burning week. But a revolt is not a revolution. Fire and fury can start a war. They cannot win one. An uprising of the enraged, without discipline, without strategy, without leadership, burns hot and then burns out. And the empire, once it recovered from its shock, would come with soldiers, with cannons, with the full weight of the most powerful military forces in the world. And not just France. Spain and Britain, circling like sharks, would soon smell weakness and move in to seize the prize for themselves. Against all of that, the rebels had rage. And rage was not going to be enough. What they needed was a mind. Someone who understood not just how to burn a plantation, but how to build an army. Someone who could turn a furious mob into disciplined soldiers, who could read the ambitions of empires and play them against one another, who could see 10 moves ahead on a board where every other player held more pieces. And here is the strange part. That person was already there. He had been there the whole time, on one of those very plantations, unremarkable, unnoticed, a man the masters had looked at 1,000 times and never truly seen. Older than most of the fighters, quiet, watchful, a man who had learned to read, who had studied the wars of the ancient world, who had spent years listening while the powerful underestimated him. The empire had no idea he existed. They were about to learn his name, and they would never forget it. His name was Toussaint, Toussaint Louverture, a name that would soon terrify the courts of Europe. He had been born enslaved on that very island, spent decades in bondage, and by the time the fires broke out he was already past 50, old by the standards of a life so brutal. Nobody expected greatness from him. That was precisely why he became so dangerous. Because while the masters had dismissed him as just another body in the field, Toussaint had been building something invisible, a mind sharpened on the writings of ancient generals, on philosophy, on the cold study of how power actually works. He had learned to read in secret. He had absorbed the strategies of Rome, and when the uprising came, he did not throw himself blindly into the flames. He waited. He watched. And then he did something no one saw coming. He took a mob and forged it into an army. Where others saw a chaotic mass of enraged, untrained people, Toussaint saw raw material. He drilled them, disciplined them, taught them to move as units, to hold formation, to strike and vanish and strike again. He turned field workers who had never held a musket into one of the most effective fighting forces in the Western Hemisphere. And then he did something even more astonishing. He outthought empires. Understand what he was facing. This was not one enemy. It was 3 of the most powerful nations on earth, all circling the same prize. France, desperate to keep its jewel. Spain, holding the other half of the island, eager to seize the whole. Britain, the mightiest military power in the world, landing troops to grab the richest colony for its own crown. Any one of them could have crushed a simple slave revolt. Toussaint faced all 3. And he played them against each other like pieces on a board. He allied with Spain when it served him, then abandoned them the moment France offered something better. He let his enemies exhaust themselves fighting each other. He understood, better than the kings and generals opposing him, that in a war of empires, the smartest player wins, not the strongest. And the empires bled. Britain poured tens of thousands of soldiers into the island, certain of victory. They were destroyed, not only by Toussaint's armies, but by disease, by the punishing climate, by an enemy who knew every mountain and every path. Britain lost more men trying to take this single island than in many of its famous wars. Eventually, humiliated, it simply gave up and sailed away. By the turn of the century, the impossible had happened. Toussaint Louverture, once enslaved, once invisible, controlled the entire island. He abolished slavery across it. He wrote a constitution. He governed. A man the system had built to be a disposable tool had instead seized the whole machine and turned it off. The wealthiest colony on earth was now ruled by the very people it had been designed to consume. But there was one man left in the world who could not accept this. One man whose ambition burned hotter than any before him, who dreamed of a global empire and saw Saint-Domingue as the key to it. A man who had just seized power in France and would soon crown himself Emperor of the Age. Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon looked across the ocean at this island of free men, this insult to everything he believed about power and race and order, and he made a decision. He would take it back. He would restore slavery. He would erase what Toussaint had built as if it had never existed. So he assembled the largest expedition France had ever sent across the Atlantic, a massive fleet. Tens of thousands of veteran soldiers, hardened in the wars of Europe, commanded by his own brother-in-law. Their orders were simple and merciless. Crush the rebellion, rechain the free, and destroy the man who had dared to defy an empire. The greatest military mind of the age was coming for a former slave. And what happened next would end in a betrayal so cruel and a victory so total that the world has never seen its like again. The betrayal came dressed as peace. Napoleon's fleet arrived and the fighting was savage, but the French could not win it outright. So they tried a different weapon: deception. They invited Toussaint to negotiate. They offered him honor, safety, a guarantee of his freedom. And Toussaint, exhausted by years of war and hoping to spare his people more bloodshed, agreed to come. It was a trap. The moment he lowered his guard, French soldiers seized him, threw him in chains, and dragged him aboard a ship. The man who had defeated 3 empires was carried across the same ocean he had crossed once before, in chains, as a slave. Only this time he was sailing in the opposite direction, toward the empire that had built its fortune on the backs of people like him. They locked him in a freezing prison high in the mountains of France, far from the warmth of the island he loved. They gave him little food, less heat, and no mercy. And there, in the cold and the dark, cut off from everything he had fought for, Toussaint Louverture died, alone. The empire had finally silenced the voice it feared most. Napoleon believed he had won. He was catastrophically wrong, because Toussaint had built something that no longer depended on him. His generals took up the fight, and now they fought with a fury beyond anything before. Because the French had shown their true intention. Napoleon's army had already begun re-enslaving people on nearby islands, clapping free men and women back into chains. The people of the island understood, with terrible clarity, that this was a war with only 2 outcomes: freedom or a return to the machine that ate human beings alive. So they fought like people who had nothing left to lose. And Napoleon's grand expedition, the largest France had ever sent across the Atlantic, tens of thousands of hardened veterans, was destroyed. Cut down by the armies of the formerly enslaved and by the diseases that swept through the French camps like a scythe. Napoleon's own brother-in-law died there. Regiment after regiment vanished. The greatest military machine in Europe was ground into nothing on a single island. and on the first day of the year 1804, it was done. The former colony declared its independence and took a new name, Haiti, an old word from the island's first peoples, chosen to bury the name the masters had given it. It became the first nation in history born from a successful uprising of the enslaved, the first free black republic in the world. A place where the people the entire system had been designed to consume had risen up, defeated the mightiest empires on earth, and seized their own freedom with their own hands. Napoleon, humiliated and broken by the loss, gave up his dreams in the Americas entirely and sold off France's vast remaining territory on the mainland for cash. That sale reshaped an entire continent. The ripples of this one island's freedom spread across the world in ways almost no one at the time could see. And now, come back with me to where we started, to the sugar, the white crystals in the bowl, the spoonful stirred into a cup of tea without a second thought. For centuries it sat on tables across the world, clean and sweet and silent, and behind every grain of it was an ocean crossed in chains, a body worked to death beside a boiling vat, a name erased from history. The sweetest thing in the world, built on the cruelest crime the world had ever organized. But that same sweetness lit a fire it could not control. It gathered 500,000 people who had every reason to burn it all down, and it gave the world Toussaint and Haiti, and proof that no chain is permanent, no empire is eternal, and no human being can be turned into a tool forever without the tool one day turning in the hand. That is the true story hidden in the sugar bowl, and most people will go their whole lives never knowing it. If this story moved you, if it showed you something you were never taught, subscribe now, because history is full of these buried truths, and there are more of them coming. The stories they left out are the ones you'll never forget.